Everybody. Let's see if we can understand sports space a little better by looking specifically at the U.S. sports space and what it entails and what it has entailed in the past. Now, one of the ideas about sports space is that it's theoretically finite, meaning once there's a sports space that everyone sort of gives their sort of passions and energy to, then it's full. Now, it can ebb and flow, right? Things can change, but the idea is that given the same demography, given the same migrant base, given the same economic base, given the same interest level, given the same sorts of opportunities to engage with the sport, if the sport stays the same the year round, then you sort of fill the space. Meaning in most countries, if you have a sport like soccer that fills the space and you can compete in soccer year round because the weather doesn't change or your geography doesn't change from high to low or coastal to inland, or if your ability to watch that sport doesn't change year round, that there's no need to have a second sport. And one of the things that's unique about the United States is we have some additional spaces. So let's start at the beginning with the sport that came to fill space and look at why we needed more. So baseball came to fill the space, right? Baseball is what we call America's pastime here in the United States. It's our grand old game, and there's all kinds of poetry and literature and song and stuff dedicated to baseball. The real key is the spread of baseball during the Civil War. So one of the unique things about the Civil War is how interconnected it made different regions of the United States. Now, we've long been a migrant country which could move to another part of the country, but all of that movement was east-west or back west to east, as opposed to north-south or south to north. During the Civil War, both with armies marching and then with prisoner of war camps, baseball was traded far and wide between different parts of the country. You had that sort of north-south exchange, south-north exchange, east-west, west-east going on. By the end of the war, it spread pretty much to all parts of the country. So baseball is our grand old sport. It's one that's been with us for a long time. We have some of the great movies of American history centered around baseball, and it would have in many countries filled the space because you wouldn't have had need to go to another sport. So in the United States, though, our geography, and particularly our climatology, our climate demands that there be another sport, if there's going to be another sport. So this map on the left here is just from 2011-2012, what the winter was going to look like, where it was going to be very cold, where it was going to snow, where it was going to be rainy, where it was going to be frozen, etc., and where you could have continued playing baseball outside for the rest of the year. It's not a big part of the country, right? So our climate, our geography, the spread of our people from low to high and from east to west and north to south means that we have a space that's different than the baseball space. So basketball is a sport that comes to occupy that space. Basketball gets introduced, it takes up that time, and it means that even when things look yucky and cold, that we have a place, a sport that occupies much of our time in that alternate space. Right? So you start with the idea that baseball could have filled the whole space if there was a certain kind of climate that persisted year round. It doesn't, so you end up with one that fills another sort of space that's opened by geography. There's also something very unique about the U.S. sports space in that we have something that other countries don't, and that is athletics in colleges. So right now, you've all grown up, probably most of you, at least most people who would take this class, have grown up in an era when the NFL, the National Football League, has been dominant in a lot of ways. They're the behemoth when it comes to television ratings and moving the needle in terms of public discourse. But that wasn't often the case. In fact, when you had the first few Super Bowls, there were plenty of open seats because the pro game was not one that was as well entrenched as the college game was. So that we have sports in our universities is as I said, is pretty unique. And one of the things that all of my students in my program, International Studies, are required to do is to go abroad. And they can be surprised sometimes to find that those universities around the world somehow get by without having sports. That doesn't mean there aren't club teams tied to it or certain kinds of sports at certain kinds of universities. For example, rowing in some places in colleges in England. But by and large, besides the United States and some schools in Canada, sports is unique. The sports are in colleges is a unique thing. So where the pro game became important after the college game was well established in the United States. And in fact, for many, many years, many decades, pro football, you'll see if you look at the old-time team lists, it was kind of a northeast corridor thing around the Great Lakes, and it spreads after that. But the Green Bay is a team that persists long into the future is something that we're impressed with. But when you go back to the very old NFL, you had Canton, Ohio, and places like that that also had pro teams and that eventually die off. So it was the college sports space that gave us things. In fact, for most of my lifetime, when I was young at least. No, it's not most of my lifetime. I'm getting old, so it's not as long as I think. But when I was young, there was something called the Chicago All-Star Football Classic or Championship that took the defending NFL champion and pit them against a team of college all-stars every year. And you had usually crowds of up to 100,000 people coming to games in Chicago to watch. And over the years, let's see, it went from the mid-30s to the mid-70s. 9 or 10 times the college players won because they were close to being on par with those pro teams. A lot of the scores were very close. The game eventually wanes as the pro game becomes more important, as insurance costs go up, and it doesn't work. But so we had a space for football to emerge. It was the college space. It gave sort of an alternate way for us to give our passions, our monies, our desires over into a sport that occupied that space. So that's sort of where the American sports space is unique. You have those three different spaces, right? On the one hand, there's one unifying sport, one space, but now you have alternate spaces within that space for sports in the United States to occupy, because you have the traditional baseball summer sort of space, the night good weather space, the basketball space, the college space. Now, you've had other sports in the past that were king at one time or another, that were up among those very important ones, and those two are horse racing and boxing. One of the things I'm going to have you read this time is about a very early figure in American boxing named Jack Johnson. Please take the time to explore that and see what it meant for him to be involved in society. Certainly when Muhammad Ali was boxing in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s a little bit, boxing was very, very important. It was something that you couldn't really escape from. It was part and parcel of who we were as the United States. We followed boxing. In fact, if you go back into the 1930s and some very famous fights, when Joe Louis fought Max Schmeling, a German boxer, in the run-up to World War II, in one of the fights that they had, it was broadcast over the radio. It's estimated that 70% of the American population listened to the game on the radio. On the one hand, you can be cynical and say, well, you know, it was cold, it was at night, it was on the radio, and what else are you going to listen to? But 70% of the population doing anything is remarkable. We'll look a little bit more about boxing, maybe about Muhammad Ali, who's this amazing transcendent figure, and later on. Horse racing is the other one, which used to be called the sport of kings. Still is referred to as the sport of kings, but it's more euphemistic because mostly people who are king-like follow it. It is one that has sort of segmented in the population to be one that the people of means in certain parts of the country follow more than everyone else. There still is some interest around the Triple Crown. So this year, when there's a Triple Crown runner, there's a lot more interest. That might be the more event-based interest. So once these were there, these were part of the sports space, and they were certainly, you would have put the three sports as baseball, boxing, and horse racing. And then eventually you have those other sports come in place of horse racing and boxing in basketball and in football. Maybe there's some future ones. Maybe there's some interest then in soccer as a league, in Major League Soccer developing, in NASCAR, in ice hockey. But whereas there's some important regional affiliations for these sports, certainly in Cascadia, that would be Portland, Seattle, Vancouver. The fandom around soccer is very strong. But then if you go across the mountains and you're in Spokane and you're in Kelowna, and you're in Ontario, Oregon, it's not the same thing, right? It doesn't span over the mountains the same way if you stay in Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland. So maybe in the future they'll get there. And NASCAR is one of those that's a very important sport in some regions of the country that drive people, sorry about the pun there, drive people to act and interact in different ways based around their interest in the sport, but it's not a national sport. And hockey's sort of the same way, that you have moments where it might transcend, like when Wayne Gretzky moved to the LA Kings, but it's one that still predominantly is a regional interest sport. Doesn't matter if there's pro teams everywhere in the country. It matters whether those pro teams resonate in the same sort of way with people. So we've got three sports now, right? We have three that are in, two that used to be in, three that might be in someday, and then we have events. So in the United States sports space, we absolutely have interest in the Olympics and in the World Cups. And the Olympics one is long-standing, the World Cups one is more recent. So the Olympics, it doesn't matter, right, if it's a summer games or a winter games that we're interested in, we're going to follow along very closely, or anymore if it's a women's World Cup or a men's World Cup, we're going to follow very closely. So this is one, though, where you would say that most of the sports in those events, so that would be soccer generally, or ice skating, skiing, short track, speed skating, etc., or BMX bike racing, or the various track and field events, they matter more to us because they're in these events. So the Olympics is in our sports space. The World Cups are in our sports space. And what you'd find with other countries would be, for example, that soccer and the World Cups are in their sports space. That it's actually the sport and the event is included in that. Whereas for us, it's the event that the sport happens to be competed at. Right? And so same thing with the Olympics. There's all kinds of interest around, say, the ice skating event or the gymnastic events, and then it wanes after the fact. So we also have events in our sports space. You might also suggest that there are individuals who transcend their sports in interesting ways, and that when those individuals transcend their sports, that you might think of them as being in our sports space as an individual. For example, golf has a very passionate following amongst many Americans. Not enough Americans to be included in the national sports space, but when Tiger Woods was very popular, when he emerged on the scene in the 1990s and stayed on the scene for the better part of 2 decades, he sort of transcended the sport and was looked at differently and engaged with differently because his individual exploits and his appeal transcended that. Arthur Ashe is one of those people for tennis. Tennis has them periodically who emerge. Arthur Ashe is someone, if you don't know who he is, you really should stop this lecture. You should pause it right now and look him up. He's one of the true great gentlemen in sporting history. He's a tennis player who was famous for winning Wimbledon, for helping take down a regime that we'll talk about later in the apartheid government with his efforts in sport, who captained the U.S. Davis Cup team to international renown, and then who was very influential both in getting awareness out for heart disease and then for HIV/AIDS. This man is a giant, and when ESPN wanted to name their Courage in Sports, or their Athlete Courage Award, they named it after Arthur Ashe. And he's someone who transcended tennis. So that isn't to say that tennis isn't very important to a lot of people. My mother, for example, my great aunt, for example, they're not going to miss any tournament. They'll watch the early rounds, the mid rounds, late rounds. That's sort of like me with soccer, right? Just because I have a passion for it doesn't mean it transcends to the rest of us. There can be individuals, though, who do transcend. Okay, so we're going to wrap up here. We're going to talk briefly about then a trio of sports, 4 events that are sort of related to the World Cups and the Olympics. That's sort of 2, so 3 plus 2, plus then individuals who emerge. It's a finite space. We're unique because there's additional spaces within our sports space for another sport to arise. You'll look, say, in the Caribbean, where in certain parts of the Caribbean, in Cuba, baseball is king. You'll look in another part of the Caribbean, in the West Indies, where cricket is king. You'll look at another part of the Caribbean where track and field is king. They don't need another sport. Their geography, their climatology, their population, their demography, they can stay with those sports, and there doesn't need to be another sport introduced. But in lots of other countries, there is going to be a space, a secondary space open up through geography or through climate. Or it could be through their tie to events, or it could be through individuals that's going to give another space. So the point of this isn't just that it's cool and neat to understand. The point is, what can be manipulated for political ends? What can you turn to and say, yes, we can use this to get our point across? We can use this to help ensure good relations with that other country, or present an image to ourselves to the rest of the world through this sport. That's what you're looking at as the sports that are in your sports space. Okay, so we'll look at domestic applications next, and then international applications following that. Keep in mind, from last lecture, on the local, personal, regional level, any kind of sport can predominate. On the national level, there's fewer sports can predominate because it has to rise up to that level, right? That's why NASCAR isn't in and hockey isn't in, even though some people say hockey's in the Big Four. It just doesn't do the same as those other 3 sports in our country. And then on the international level, what we're going to look at is what you need is the same sport replicated in multiple sports spaces to be able to use that sport effectively in international relations.